In 1947, Britain grew nearly half its own vegetables, not on farms, in back gardens, on council allotments, and in old bomb craters filled with rubble and compost. By 2020, that number had collapsed to less than 3%. We forgot how to feed ourselves. Not because the knowledge was complicated, but because supermarkets made it feel unnecessary. Number 14 on this list was banned by some councils, yet it produced more food per square foot than anything Monty Don has ever shown you. And number 7 was so effective that the Ministry of Agriculture actively promoted it during both world wars. These 20 habits kept British families fed when the money ran out and the shops ran empty. Let us count them down. Number 20. Saving seeds from year to year. Your grandmother never bought seeds twice for the same vegetable. When the runner beans turned leathery on the vine at the end of summer, she left a handful to dry completely, then shelled them into old tobacco tins or brown paper envelopes marked in pencil. Scarlet Emperor, 1953. Back garden. Those dried beans sat in the cool of the pantry through winter, ready for sowing the following May. The same ritual applied to tomatoes. She would scoop seeds onto a saucer, let them dry on the windowsill for a week, then store them in folded newspaper. Peas, broad beans, lettuce, marigolds, everything that set seed was harvested and kept. A packet of seeds from Woolworths cost 6pence in 1955, but saving your own cost nothing and gave you varieties perfectly adapted to your own soil. Seed merchants hated this habit. By the 1980s, they started selling hybrid varieties that would not breed true, forcing gardeners back to the shop every spring. Your grandmother's seeds were not just thrift. They were independence. She answered to no catalogue and no garden centre. Her varieties had names the seed companies had never heard of, passed along the terrace like borrowed sugar. Some families kept the same strain of broad bean going for 30 years, each generation selecting the strongest pods and the fattest seeds. That is how you bred a vegetable perfectly suited to your climate, your soil, and your kitchen. No laboratory required. Number 19. Trenching for deep roots. Before raised beds became fashionable, your grandfather dug trenches. Proper trenches. 2 spits deep, which meant 2 spade depths, roughly 18 inches into heavy clay soil. He would dig out the top layer, set it aside, fork over the bottom, then fill the trench with kitchen scraps, torn newspaper and old cabbage stalks, before replacing the topsoil on top. This created a deep channel of fertility that roots could chase downward for moisture, even during the driest July. Runner beans planted along these trenches grew 8 feet tall and cropped from July to October without fail. The trench held moisture like a buried reservoir. Parsnips and carrots sent taproots straight and deep instead of forking on stones. The whole process took a weekend in winter, cost absolutely nothing, and transformed compacted council estate clay into something that grew food like a market garden. Modern no-dig methods have their merits, but trenching built the soil that fed a generation, and it asked for nothing but a strong back and a sharp spade. Number 18. Rhubarb forcing with a dustbin. Every allotment in Yorkshire had at least one upturned dustbin or chimney pot sitting over a rhubarb crown come January. The darkness forced the plant to send up pale pink stalks searching for light, tender and sweet, weeks before the outdoor crop was ready. Your grandmother would check under the bin every few days, pulling stalks gently when they reached about 12 inches. Forced rhubarb was the first fresh harvest of the year, arriving in February when the garden offered nothing else. The stalks needed less sugar than outdoor rhubarb, which meant the crumble stretched further. A single crown cost 2 shillings from the market in 1950, but once planted it lasted decades, splitting and spreading until half the garden blushed pink every spring. The Yorkshire rhubarb triangle between Leeds, Bradford, and Wakefield built an entire industry on this principle, using dark forcing sheds heated by coal. But your grandmother did it with a dustbin and patience. No electricity, no heating. Just the knowledge that darkness made sweetness. Some women wrapped the dustbin in old sacking for insulation, squeezing out an extra week of earliness. The first sticks of forced rhubarb in February felt like a small miracle after months of nothing but stored roots and pickled cabbage. Number 17. Succession. Sowing every fortnight. Your grandfather never sowed a whole packet of lettuce seed at once. He knew that would give him 40 lettuces in the same week and nothing for the rest of the summer. Instead, he sowed a short row every 2 weeks from April to August. This meant fresh lettuce arriving at the table continuously, rather than in one useless glut. The same principle applied to radishes, spring onions, and beetroot. A pinch of seed every fortnight. The technique required discipline, and a scrap of paper pinned inside the shed door with sowing dates penciled in columns. It looked like a factory production schedule, because that is exactly what it was. A tiny back garden running on precision timing could outproduce a plot 3 times the size where everything went in at once, and half of it bolted or rotted before anyone could eat it. This habit vanished when people stopped growing food regularly, but it remains the single most effective method for feeding a family from a small space. Number 16. Liquid feed from nettles. Behind every shed stood a bucket of rotting nettles steeped in rainwater, and the smell could strip paint. Your grandmother filled an old galvanized bucket with young nettle tops, weighed them down with a brick, covered the lot with water, and left it for 3 weeks. The resulting brown liquid was diluted 10-to-1 and watered onto tomatoes, beans, and courgettes every week through summer. Nettles are packed with nitrogen, iron, and potassium, the same nutrients you pay £4 a bottle for at the garden centre. This free fertilizer produced tomatoes so heavy the trusses needed tying twice. The only cost was the smell, which lingered on hands for hours and made the dog avoid the garden entirely. Comfrey leaves worked the same way, with even higher potassium for fruiting crops. Every serious allotment keeper had a comfrey patch planted specifically for cutting and rotting into feed. They called it black gold. The garden centre called it lost revenue. Your grandmother made enough plant food for the entire growing season from a weed that grew free on every wasteland and railway embankment in Britain. She would have laughed at the idea of paying £4 for a plastic bottle of tomato feed. When your grandfather needed to start crops early or protect them from late frost, he did not buy a greenhouse. He leaned old sash windows together over the seed bed, creating a glass tent that trapped warmth and kept rain off tender plants. 2 windows propped against each other, forming an inverted V, made a cloche that could stretch the growing season by 6 weeks at either end. Lettuce under glass in March. French beans under glass in October. Some men built cold frames from old floorboards and a single window hinged at the back with a strip of leather. These rough boxes sat against south-facing walls, warming in the morning sun and holding heat into the evening. Seedlings raised in cold frames were hardier than anything from a heated greenhouse. They grew slowly, built strong stems, and rarely suffered transplant shock. Every demolished house, every replaced window became raw material for food production. Nothing was wasted. Not even broken glass, which was carefully cut to size and sealed with putty. Number 14. Keeping chickens in the back garden. Before councils started issuing bylaws against it, half the terraced streets in Britain had chickens scratching behind the coal shed. A dozen hens cost about 10 shillings in 1952 and produced enough EGGS to feed the family with surplus to trade. Your grandmother kept Rhode Island Reds or light Sussex in a wooden ark She moved across the lawn every few days, fertilizing the grass and keeping the hens on fresh ground. Kitchen scraps, vegetable peelings, stale bread soaked in milk. Nothing edible went in the bin. It went in the chicken bucket by the back door. The hens turned waste into eggs, and the eggs turned into cakes, omelets, and barter currency. Half a dozen eggs could buy a cabbage from the neighbor or settle a debt at the corner shop. During both wars, the government actively encouraged backyard poultry through the Domestic Poultry Keepers Council. But by the 1960s, councils began restricting or banning garden hens. Noise complaints, smell complaints. The slow creep of regulation pushed chickens off the terrace and into factory farms. Families lost a source of free protein that had sustained them for generations. The irony is sharp. We banned backyard hens that ate scraps and lived on grass, then bought eggs from caged birds that never saw daylight. The chickens made perfect sense, and every grandmother who kept them knew it. Pattern break. Here is something the garden centers will never tell you. Your grandmother composted before composting had a name. She did not buy a tumbler or a wormery or watch YouTube videos about carbon to nitrogen ratios. She dug a hole at the bottom of the garden and threw everything in. Potato peelings, tea leaves, eggshells, and grass clippings. On occasion, even the contents of the chamber pot, though nobody talked about that. She covered each layer with soil and left it alone. By the following spring, that hole contained the richest, darkest earth you have ever seen. Worms did the work, rain did the watering. Time did the rest. Modern composting has been turned into a hobby, requiring equipment, thermometers, and activators that cost £15 a box. Your grandmother needed a spade and a spare corner. The result was identical. Free fertility from waste, closing the loop between kitchen and garden without spending a single penny. Number 12. Earthing up potatoes with old newspapers. When seed potatoes pushed their first green shoots above the soil, your grandfather covered them, not with expensive horticultural fleece, but with sheets of dampened newspaper weighted down with stones. As the shoots grew taller, he replaced the newspaper with mounded soil drawn up around the stems, burying all but the top inch of growth. This earthing up prevented the tubers from turning green and poisonous in the sunlight. But the newspaper trick at the start served a double purpose. It suppressed weeds around the emerging shoots, and it held moisture against the soil surface during dry April spells. An old copy of the Daily Mirror became mulch. The Radio Times became weed control. Nothing bought from the shop could do the job better. The potatoes underneath grew clean and plentiful in the dark, loose soil, sometimes yielding 20 pounds from a single 10-foot row. That was a week of meals from a strip of earth no wider than a doormat. Number 11. Growing marrows for winter storage. The enormous marrows your grandfather grew were not for village show competitions, despite what everyone assumed. They were for eating in December. A properly ripened marrow with tough, hard skin could sit in the cool of the pantry for 3 months without spoiling. Your grandmother would stuff them with leftover mince and onions, or slice and fry them in dripping, or bake them into chutney that lined the shelf in old jam jars. Marrows grew fast and huge on compost heaps with almost no attention. A single plant could produce 5 or 6 fruits, weighing 10 pounds each. That was 60 pounds of food from 1 seed, 1 square yard of compost heap, and a few buckets of water through July. No other vegetable came close to that yield for the effort involved. When courgettes became fashionable in the 1970s, the marrow fell from favor. People forgot that the whole point was size. The bigger the marrow, the longer it lasted, and the further it stretched through winter when nothing else was growing. Number 10. Jam making from foraged fruit. Every September, your grandmother walked the hedgerows with a basket, and came home with hands stained purple from blackberries. She knew every bush within a mile, which ones ripened first, which produced the sweetest fruit, and which were too close to the road. The berries went into the preserving pan with sugar bought in bulk, boiled until setting point, then ladled into jars saved throughout the year. Blackberry and apple jam, damson jam, rosehip syrup for the children's vitamin C through winter. A good September afternoon produced enough jam to last until Easter. The jars lined the pantry shelf like an edible savings account, each one worth 6pence saved at the grocer. Crab apples from the park made jelly. Elderberries made wine that your grandfather swore was medicinal. The hedgerow was a free supermarket that restocked itself every autumn, and your grandmother knew every aisle. She also knew the unwritten law. You picked from common land and never from a neighbor's boundary. You left the low berries for children and the high ones for the birds, and you always left enough for next year's crop. That was not sentimentality. That was resource management learned across generations. Your grandfather did not have a chest freezer. He had a wooden box filled with damp sand, kept in the coal shed or under the stairs. Carrots, beetroot, and parsnips pulled from the garden in October were layered into this sand, each vegetable separated so none touched its neighbor. The sand kept them cool, dark, and slightly moist, preventing shriveling while stopping rot. Stored this way, root vegetables lasted well into March. 5 months of fresh food without electricity, without cling film, without a single trip to the supermarket. The key was harvesting on a dry day and brushing off loose soil without washing. Water invited mold. Sand prevented it. Turnips and Swedes went in the same box. Onions hung in plaited strings from the shed rafters, drying in the draft. Apples were checked weekly, and any showing brown spots were pulled out and used immediately before rot spread to the rest. The entire autumn harvest could be preserved for winter using nothing but sand, string, and the knowledge of when to pull and when to leave. Your grandmother ran a storage system as effective as any commercial cold store, powered by common sense and a dark corner of the house. Number 8. Intercropping fast and slow growers. Your grandmother planted radishes between rows of parsnips because she understood time. Parsnips take 20 weeks to mature. Radishes take 4. By the time the parsnip seedlings needed the space, the radishes were eaten and gone, leaving the soil loosened and the row clearly marked. This was not a modern permaculture invention. It was common sense on a small plot where every square foot had to earn its keep. Lettuce grew between sweet corn. Spring onions bordered the carrot rows. Quick crops were harvested before slow crops needed the room. A 10 by 12 foot garden using intercropping produced nearly double the food of the same space, planted in tidy single rows with bare soil between them. The technique required knowing how fast each vegetable grew and how much space it needed at maturity. Your grandmother kept that information in her head, updated annually through observation. No app required. Number 7. Double digging the Victory Garden. During both World Wars, the government told every household to dig for victory, and they meant it literally. Parks, tennis courts, and front lawns were turned into vegetable plots using the double dig method. Your grandfather would mark out his plot, then dig each row to 2 spade depths. The bottom spit was broken up with a fork, manure was added, and the top spit from the next row was turned over on top. The process created deeply cultivated soil that grew vegetables with extraordinary vigor. By 1943, there were nearly 1.5 million allotments in Britain, and domestic gardens produced over 1 million tons of vegetables. The double dig method was at the heart of it. The Ministry of Agriculture distributed leaflets explaining the technique to households who had never grown so much as a pansy. Those wartime gardens fed a nation under siege, proving that the British back garden was capable of serious food production when necessity demanded it. The habit stuck for decades after the war ended. Men who had dug for victory kept digging because they had seen what their own soil could do. Their children grew up eating food that traveled 10 feet from plot to plate, fresher than anything a shop could offer. Pattern break. Nobody talks about this, but your grandmother's garden was never just about vegetables. She grew marigolds between the tomato plants because she knew the scent repelled whitefly. Nasturtiums climbed the bean poles and attracted blackfly away from the broad beans, sacrificing themselves so the crop survived. Lavender bordered the vegetable patch because it brought in bees for pollination. Every flower had a job. Nothing was ornamental for its own sake when food was at stake. This companion planting was not learned from books. It was learned from watching what worked and what failed, season after season, gossip exchanged over garden fences and passed down through families like a living textbook that updated itself every year. When organic gardening became fashionable in the 1990s, it repackaged this ancient knowledge in glossy magazines and sold it back to us at full price. Your grandmother would have shaken her head. She had been doing it since 1942 and never once called it organic. She called it gardening. Rain butts on every downpipe. Every house had a water butt catching rainwater off the roof, because Maine's water cost money, and rainwater was better for the garden anyway. Your grandfather connected old barrels or galvanized tanks to the downpipe with a bit of bent guttering, collecting hundreds of gallons through the British winter. Rainwater is naturally soft, free of chlorine, and at ambient temperature, which means it does not shock plant roots the way cold tap water does. In the dry summers of 1959 and 1976, families with water butts kept their gardens alive, while neighbors watched their crops wither under hosepipe bans. A second-hand barrel cost a few shillings. The connection was bodged together from scraps, but the result was water independence during the months that mattered most. Your grandmother grew tomatoes in buckets, potatoes in old dustbins, and herbs in cracked teapots sitting on the back step. If it held soil and had drainage, it became a planter. Old tin baths grew salad leaves. Wooden crates from the greengrocer raised strawberries off the wet ground. Chimney pots left over from demolished houses became deep containers for carrots. Nothing was purpose-built. Everything was repurposed. A backyard with no actual soil could still produce enough salad, herbs, and tomatoes to make a visible dent in the shopping bill. The container garden asked for nothing but compost, water, and a south-facing wall. This was not urban farming as a lifestyle trend. This was a woman with 6 children and no garden making sure there were tomatoes for tea. Number 3. Keeping a pig on scraps. In rural and semi-rural Britain, the backyard pig was the ultimate food recycling system. Families clubbed together in pig clubs, pooling kitchen scraps and vegetable waste to fatten a shared pig through the year. By autumn, the pig was slaughtered, and the meat divided among contributing households. Every part was used. Hams were salted and hung, belly was cured into bacon, trotters went into broth, the head became brawn, even the blood was caught for black pudding. A single pig could provide a family with meat for months, all raised on waste that would otherwise have gone to the midden. The Pig Marketing Board reported over 400,000 registered backyard pigs in 1947. The practice was actively encouraged during rationing, with extra rations allocated to pig keepers. Regulations tightened through the 1950s and the 1960s, and the backyard pig slowly disappeared. But for families who remembered, that pig was worth more than any savings account. The killing day was an event. Neighbors came to help, skills were shared, children were sent away until the worst was done, then brought back to watch the salting and the curing. It was honest and it was brutal, and it was the most efficient food system a working-class family ever devised. Number 2. Preserving the glut. When the garden produced more than anyone could eat, your grandmother preserved everything. Runner beans were salted in layers in big stoneware crocks, packed tight with coarse salt, and stored in the pantry for winter. Onions were pickled in malt vinegar. Green tomatoes that would not ripen before frost were turned into chutney. Apples were wrapped individually in newspaper and laid in single layers in wooden trays, stored in the loft. Pears were bottled in syrup, in Kilner jars, sterilized in the oven. Every surplus was captured and stored against the lean months. Nothing was given away until the family had enough put by. The pantry shelf in November told the story of the year's garden. Rows of jars, crocks of salted beans, trays of apples, strings of onions. It was a larder built from the earth by hand, insurance against a hard winter, and proof that a garden could feed you long after the last frost blackened the final courgette. Number 1. Sharing seeds, knowledge, and surplus over the garden fence. The most powerful habit was never about soil or seeds, it was about community. Your grandmother traded surplus runner beans for her neighbor's gooseberries. Your grandfather swapped a punnet of tomato seedlings for a bag of horse manure from the man 3 doors down. Knowledge passed freely, which potato variety survived the blight, when to plant out broad beans, how to stop carrot fly with a barrier of old carpet. Allotment sheds were classrooms where retired miners taught young fathers how to double dig. Church halls hosted seed swaps every February. Women's Institute meetings circulated the best rhubarb crown divisions and the secret to setting strawberry jam. No one paid for advice. No one hoarded knowledge. The garden fence was a network more effective than any internet forum because it came with trust, accountability, and a shared interest in making sure everyone on the street had enough to eat. When communities stopped growing food, they did not just lose the vegetables. They lost the conversation, the cooperation, and the quiet understanding that looking after your neighbor's garden was the same as looking after your own. That is the list. 20 habits that kept Britain fed when the money ran thin and the shelves ran bare. Try one this spring. Save a seed, dig a trench, rot some nettles in a bucket, and watch your tomatoes grow twice the size. Then tell me your grandmother did not know exactly what she was doing.